Welcome to the course called Computer Applications in Medical Illustration. This course is designed to introduce you to the wide variety of computer graphics software that's used in the medical illustration profession. Some of the software is very common in the graphic arts industry and is used by a variety of professionals in all different graphics fields. But some of the software that we'll be talking about is very specialized for the medical and scientific illustrator. This course will also introduce some basic principles such as the concept of resolution, the digital reproduction of color, output such as print output, and other basic computer graphics concepts. Today's first lecture is designed to just give you a quick overview of the different kinds of computer graphics software that you'll be exposed to throughout the curriculum and probably throughout your career as a medical illustrator. This course will only dive into some of these things in depth, but you'll be exposed to pretty much all of the software that I'm going to talk about over the course of the rest of the curriculum. Let's start out by talking about what most people would consider the most basic kinds of computer graphics software. This is two-dimensional drawing software. These are programs that are designed to create just static two-dimensional images. So there's no motion, no animation, no interactivity, and the images exist just in 2 dimensions. The images may appear to have 3 dimension. Obviously, you can create the illusion of a 3-dimensional object by using light and shadow, but the images exist just in a 2-dimensional medium. Later, we'll be talking about 3-dimensional illustration, 3-dimensional software that actually constructs virtual models in 3-dimensional space. 2-dimensional drawing programs are broken down into 2 broad categories: raster software and vector software. A raster program is one that constructs images out of pixels. The word pixel is short for picture element. A pixel, as most of you probably know, is just a small square portion of an image, and you modify images by simply changing the color of pixels. The 2 most popular raster image software on the market today would be Adobe Photoshop and Corel Painter. Photoshop was originally designed as a tool for simply editing photos digitally, but it turns out to have very robust drawing and painting tools as well, and it's probably the preferred 2-dimensional painting software for the majority of medical illustrators. But a number of people have begun to use Corel Painter because it offers more natural painting tools. It offers more variety of brush textures and surface textures, so you can simulate painting on canvas or watercolor paper or some other kind of textured surface. Let's take a quick look at Photoshop. Here is an image that I created recently in Photoshop. This is obviously an illustration of the ribs, the vertebrae, the sternum, and this was designed to help surgeons place a device in the proper location within the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava passing through the right atrium of the heart. So the illustration is designed to show the position of the heart within the body and the location of some of these anatomic structures relative to bony landmarks that can actually be felt or palpated on the surface of the body. Now, if we zoom way in on this image, you begin to see the individual pixels that make up the image. So the entire image is composed of these small square colored areas. And when you paint in a program like Photoshop, all you're doing is simply changing the color of each of those picture elements or pixels. So I can choose a simple tool like the pencil tool, and with this tool I can change colors of individual pixels one at a time, or I could draw a line with the pencil tool. I don't use the pencil tool very much myself because, as you can see, it creates this very jagged kind of a line, which is not going to look very good when printed or when it's viewed on screen. It's much more common to use the brush tool. We'll talk about the brush tool quite a bit more in the future. Brush tool allows you to create much smoother looking lines. Now, at this magnification, it looks very, very fuzzy, but if I were to zoom out, it would look a lot better. What you can see with the brush tool is that as I paint with this particular tool, there's a transition from the black line to whatever the surrounding color is. So Photoshop creates a kind of a stepwise series of colored pixels to create a smooth transition from the background to the colored line. And now if I were to zoom back out, you can see what those two things look like here on this rib in the upper right. The paintbrush line still looks kind of fuzzy because I painted it specifically with a soft edge brush, but I can alter the hardness of that brush, and that's going to give me a much smoother looking line at this magnification. But again, if I zoom in, we'll see that it still has that transitional edge between the black line and the surrounding area. By the way, that transition is known as anti-aliasing, the creation of this fringe of pixels that transitions from the color of the object in the foreground to the object behind it. So that's a very quick introduction to raster software such as Photoshop, which, as I say, uses these picture elements or pixels to construct the entire image. So everything on here, including the lines, the text, everything is constructed out of pixels. The other category of two-dimensional drawing software is known as vector software. Vector programs create images out of points and mathematically defined paths. I'll show you that in just a minute. You draw these points that are referred to as anchor points, and the anchor points are connected together by paths. Paths can either be straight line segments that connect one point to another, or they may be curved line segments connecting the points together. And you can give each of these paths a fill color. You can fill in the interior of a shape. You can apply a color to the path itself, what we call the stroke color, and construct all of your objects using these mathematically defined paths. Now, you don't have to understand the math. The software calculates all of the math necessary to remember the position of the points and the shape of the paths. Many years ago, there were actually several competitors on the market, several different vector programs, but in more recent years, one has come to just completely dominate the market. Others have either been absorbed into Adobe or have simply disappeared. So the reigning vector software right now is Adobe Illustrator. Let's take a quick look at Adobe Illustrator. This is just a blank canvas in Illustrator, and I want to just show you very quickly what I'm talking about when I refer to these points and paths. So I'm grabbing a pen tool from the toolbar, and I think you'll find that this is the tool that you use most often for creating objects. There are some geometric shape tools that allow you to create rectangles and ellipses and polygons and so on, which have their use, but in medical art, most of your objects are more natural and more organic in their appearance, and so you want to create more natural, more irregularly shaped objects, and the pen tool is perfect for that. There are a couple different ways you can use the pen tool. One is to simply click a series of points. You see that little blue point and another blue point and so on. And notice that every time I click a new point, it is connected to the previous point with a line segment or path. If we look in the color palette, you'll see that there are two little boxes here that describe the color of the different components of this shape that I've created. This solid box here, which is colored white, that represents the fill color of the object. So you can't really see it right now, but this object is actually filled in with white. If I were to choose some other color, you'd see that the object fills in completely with that color that I've chosen. And even though these two endpoints on this object are not connected together, the fill color still connects the two endpoints, so to speak, so that we have this shape that appears to be a completely enclosed shape. There's another box here, and I can click on the box that appears to have a black outline, and notice when I click on it, it brings that box forward. So now any changes that I make to the color are going to affect the stroke. In other words, the color of the path. I don't have to have a stroke color on the object. If you look down here in the color palette, there's this little white box with a red slash through it that says none. If I select that, then my stroke color has disappeared. I could do the same thing with the fill. I could also give it no fill. In which case I have anchor points and I have paths, but this object would not show up at all. It would be completely invisible. In fact, if I take one of my selection tools and just click out here in blank space, I can deselect the object and you see that it disappears. But it's still there, it's just that it doesn't have any fill color or any stroke color. So let me put some kind of fill color back onto the object. So when you use the pen tool, as I said, you can simply click a bunch of straight points to create these straight line segments. But I think for the majority of the artwork that you create, you're going to want to use curving paths as opposed to these very straight, very angular line segments. And this takes a little getting used to, and we'll talk a lot more about this specifically at another time, but I'll just demonstrate that you can click a point, and with your mouse you're going to click but then hold the mouse button down, and as you're holding the mouse button you're going to drag. And what I've created here is an anchor point at the center of this line, and then these two lines here, these two blue lines with the little tips on them, that is not something that's actually going to show up on screen when I view this image, and it's not something that's going to print. Those are what are called handlebars, or control bars, I think is the official name for them in Adobe software. But those lines control the direction and the amount of curvature of the path. Let me click a second point, and I'm going to hold the mouse button down and drag to create these handlebars or control bars. And you'll see that when I do that, now we've created a line segment. So there's a curving line here that connects the first anchor point to the second anchor point. And these small blue lines with the little tips at the ends, those are control bars that control the amount of curvature and the direction that the curve follows. And what you might notice is that the curve kind of parallels this first handlebar, but then begins to deviate away from that handlebar as the curve moves over to connect to the second anchor point. And at this point, the curve is kind of following parallel to the handlebar of this point. And now I can click another point, and notice the more I drag the points out, the more this handlebar is kind of pushing this curve over to the left. Now you'll also notice that the fill color is doing something funny here. It almost looks like I have two separate shapes, but it's really just one object. It's just that the fill color automatically fills in from the beginning point to the last point on the curve. So I can create another object, and I can come around, and if I want to make this a completely enclosed shape where all of the anchor points are connected, I position the cursor over the initial anchor point. Notice that the pen tool gets a little circle symbol in the bottom right corner. That tells me that I'm about to close the object, and I click and drag again, and now I have a completely enclosed shape. And I could change the fill color of that. Once again, I could go back here to the stroke, and I could put a stroke on there. So a vector program like Adobe Illustrator creates all objects using these anchor points and these paths, and you have these control bars or handlebars to control the curvature and the orientation of each curve. I have some selection tools that I can use that allow me to move individual points around, and notice when I move that anchor point that the curve automatically reflows to the new position of the anchor point. I can also click on the ends of the handlebars to change the curvature of the paths. Over here I could pull this curve in so it doesn't extend quite so far out to the right. I can grab this handlebar and do that some more, so I have more of a blunted shape here. So I have lots of control over the position of these anchor points and the curves that I create using these different tools. It takes a little getting used to, and we'll spend some time just getting used to using the pen tool. Now, because Illustrator uses these anchor points and paths, it's very easy to create artwork which is very, very crisp and very clean. In other words, there are no jagged edges, there are no soft fuzzy edges. It's easy to create objects that have a very, very hard, very crisp edges to them. It's a little more challenging to create highlights and shadows and subtle variations in form. It's harder to create subtle shadows and highlights and things that give the appearance of form. Therefore, many people use Illustrator to create fairly simple artwork, such as charts and graphs. Something like these graphs here are very simple to create by simply creating a rectangle and then drawing some lines on the rectangle to create the grid of gray lines in the background, and then to create these the different curves on the graph. It's a simple matter of just drawing a series of anchor points and paths. So it's very easy to construct very neat looking, very clean looking graphs, very professional quality graphs such as this. And that's what a lot of people use Illustrator for exclusively, is to just create this very, very kind of simple charts and graphs and things. It's also very easy to create very simple illustrations filled with flat colors. Notice this arm down here. There's essentially no highlights or shadows on the arm. There's a tiny little highlight here where the needle is going in and a small cast shadow, but for the most part the whole arm is drawn with just flat colors. And something like this syringe is drawn using just a series of simple geometric shapes filled in with flat colors. And even this little block of skin here, it appears to have a lighter side and a darker side, so there's a little bit of three-dimensional form there, but that's achieved just by drawing rectangular shapes and filling each rectangular shape with just a flat color. So a lot of people, as I said, will use Illustrator exclusively for creating simple charts and graphs and this sort of simple schematic artwork. But it is possible to create more complex art that has a very definite sense of three-dimensional form to it. So for example, this eye on the left side of the screen was created using tools called gradients, which is a feature that's built right into Illustrator. And once you get the hang of these gradients, you can really create objects that have quite a bit of three-dimensional form to them. The same thing with these cylinders here. These are meant to represent muscle fibers that are present within the eye muscles. These use a group of simple gradients that go from a dark red to a bright highlight back to a dark red on the other side to create this sense of cylindrical form. The image on the right utilizes a variety of techniques to create the illusion of depth and three-dimensional form. And one project that you'll be doing in this class is to really push the limits of these tools to create an image that almost has a sense of photorealism, photographic realism. So combining your knowledge of gradients and a number of other tools to create something that has a photographic realism to it. This is a student project from a couple years ago, and this is created using nothing but anchor points and paths. And if I click on one of these, you can see that there are paths and anchor points inside of every one of these shapes. Now, I think you can tell that it's quite complex, especially that part, but these are all tools that you'll know how to do by the time the course ends. At the opposite extreme, you can also use Illustrator to create very simple art, such as this line art, which mimics the appearance of pen and ink. And we'll be doing this kind of technique too. So there's really a range of different styles that you can create in Adobe Illustrator. Everything from simple charts and graphs to this sort of line art technique that looks very much like traditional pen and ink, all the way up to something that has quite a high degree of photorealism to it. So far we've talked about just two different kinds of two-dimensional drawing programs. These raster image programs such as Photoshop that construct images out of pixels, and vector software such as Adobe Illustrator that constructs images out of points and mathematically defined paths. In this course we'll also be talking about page layout software. This is a type of software that's designed specifically to combine images that were created in other programs and combine those images with text and other sorts of objects, such as geometric shapes. You can do much of this in a program like Illustrator. So in Illustrator, you can create vector graphics. You can also import raster images that were created in Photoshop or another raster program, and you can combine all of those different elements and add text and add geometric shapes and so on right in Illustrator. There are two downsides, though, to using Illustrator for this kind of work. So two reasons why we also have these separate page layout programs. Probably the biggest reason is that Illustrator cannot create multiple page documents. Even the most recent version of Illustrator is limited to creating just a single page document. So if you're designing a brochure that has multiple pages, or laying out an entire magazine or an entire book, you're going to need a page layout program that allows you to create multiple page documents. Another disadvantage to using Illustrator for something like this, even, let's say you have just a one-page document, when you place images into Illustrator, those images become embedded within the Illustrator file, and it can rapidly make the size of the file ballooned to a very large file size. With page layout programs, when you place an image into the page layout software, all it does is creates a link to the original file on your computer. It's not actually embedding that image into the page layout. It's simply linking to it. And now this means that if you take that page layout file and move it to another computer, you also have to bring all of the linked files with you. So if you have a couple of Illustrator files and a couple of Photoshop files that you've placed into your page layout, if you want to be able to work on that file on another computer or take it to a place to have it printed, you have to bring all of those linked files with you so that the page layout software can then link back to those files. But by doing that, it keeps the file size of the page layout file quite small. Historically, page layout programs have been used specifically to create multiple page documents that are destined for print output. So page layout software is used for laying out magazines, books, brochures, pamphlets, any kind of multiple page document that's destined to be printed. You can use page layout software also to create simple web pages, but they're not really the ideal software designed for that. You can also use page layout programs to design documents that are going to be saved in PDF format, which may be distributed on the web. That's a very good use for page layout software, is to lay something out that you want to save as a PDF file. But still, they're primarily designed for print output. There are two programs that are widely used for page layout. Many years ago, most designers who were doing page layout and desktop publishing used a program called Quark Express. This is one of the earliest page layout programs that was designed specifically for generating print output from a digital file. Adobe introduced a program called InDesign. It's got to be at least 15 years ago that they first introduced that. And graphic designers and artists rapidly switched over to using InDesign because it used the familiar Adobe interface. It used many of the same tools that you find in programs like Photoshop and Illustrator. It uses many of the same keyboard shortcuts that you would find in other Adobe products. So InDesign integrates nicely with the whole package of Adobe software, and therefore it's very appealing to graphic designers and artists who are already familiar with Adobe software. But people in the printing industry, the people who actually have to generate the high quality output on some kind of printing device, they still actually prefer Quark. So you've got designers on the one hand who are designing a lot of documents in InDesign, but then you've got the print professionals who prefer Quark. So both programs are still out there and they're still widely used. Let's take a quick look at InDesign as an example of a page layout program. This is a simple page layout that I put together as a demonstration for class, and this consists primarily of a large raster image that was created in Photoshop that's been placed into the background of this page. And I can click on this and pick it up and move it around, and you can see that this is an object that I can move around and position somewhere on the page. Let's put that back where it came from. So we've got one large raster image. This Pfizer logo down here was created in Illustrator as a vector object. And you'll see that I can pick that up and move it around as well. Now the logo itself is pure white, but within InDesign I was able to add that drop shadow effect so that it kind of gives the logo a little bit of a three-dimensional appearance. And let's put that back where it came from. If it wasn't for the drop shadow, if I put the logo out here, it would be completely invisible because it's just a solid white shape. I've also added some text, which I added directly in InDesign. InDesign has a variety of text tools that allow you to create and format text. So this is also a separate object that I can pick up and move around. Once again, the text itself is white, so it would be invisible over here on the white background, except for the fact that there's also a drop shadow that I've added in InDesign. And finally, there's just a simple little rectangular shape down here that was also added in InDesign. So you can combine raster images, vector images, text, geometric shapes, as well as adding effects like these drop shadows and other kinds of effects. Similar to page layout software, there is software that's designed specifically for designing web pages and authoring other sorts of interactive media that you would find on the internet. Whereas a program like InDesign or Quark Express is designed to combine text and graphics for print output, these web design and authoring tools combine text, graphics, animations, and other kinds of multimedia effects to create web pages, games, apps for your iPad or your phone, and various kinds of interactive media. These web design and authoring programs typically use something called WYSIWYG, maybe a term that you've heard before. That stands for what you see is what you get, meaning you position all of the elements within the software exactly the way you'd like them to appear in the finished product. And then the software generates the code, essentially the computer language, that's necessary to describe that page, so that when somebody opens your web page in their favorite web browser, it's reading that computer code and then creates the page exactly the way you had designed it, exactly the way you intended it to look. So you design it to look a certain way, and then the software generates the code in HTML, that's hypertext markup language, which is the language used by web pages, or CSS, cascading style sheets. It's another alternate language that's used for web design, JavaScript, or whatever other computer language or scripting language is necessary to describe the page. For web design, there are a variety of programs out there. One that you'll be exposed to in our program is Adobe Dreamweaver. part of the whole Adobe package. You'll be exposed a little bit to some gaming software. The Unity game engine is one that we use quite a bit here at RIT. There's something called the Unreal Development Kit, or UDK. These are the software that allow you to create games, and a lot of the sophisticated computer games that you see are designed using this software. There are new authoring tools such as iBooks Author from Apple, which is designed to create the iBooks that you can purchase from Apple's website, from the iTunes store. So you can actually author your own iBooks that incorporate not only the traditional text and two-dimensional graphics that you'd find in a typical book, but an iBook, of course, has the luxury of being able to incorporate animation and three-dimensional media and interactive media all into a sort of electronic book format. Let's take a look at one simple example of a web design program, Adobe Dreamweaver. This is a very simple web page that I designed many years ago. You can see that what I've done here is positioned text and some simple graphics on the page and laid everything out exactly the way I want it to look on the page. So very similar to using a page layout program, when I simply position these different elements on the page. But then the software automatically generates all of the computer code, in this case HTML code, that defines all of the different elements on the page. I know a little bit of HTML, so theoretically I could actually program all of this myself, writing all of this code, but it's very difficult and very time consuming, and in particular it's very hard to go back and edit all of this and get it right to make it look exactly the way you want it. It's so much easier to simply design the page the way you want it to look and then let the computer generate the code for you. In our medical illustration program, you may have already been introduced to some three-dimensional modeling. If you haven't already, you will be soon. Three-dimensional modeling software generates three-dimensional virtual models, so it keeps track of the three-dimensional coordinates of each object and allows you to position these 3D virtual models into a virtual environment. So you can create an entire scene, such as a room scene filled with three-dimensional virtual furniture. You can generate lighting that illuminates the room. Each of the objects, you can then add color to that object. You can add surface textures, so you can create things like wood grain or fabric or metallic texture, really any kind of texture you'd want on your objects. You can then add the lighting to the scene. You can have a variety of different kinds of light sources within the scene, and then a variety of rendering effects to create a certain kind of atmosphere within the environment. And then finally, you can render these images out as scenes, which may be photorealistic. I'm sure you've seen examples of images that were rendered in 3D software that are just absolutely indistinguishable from a photo. Of course, you can also make these three-dimensional objects move within their virtual environment and generate animations. And again, I'm sure you've seen lots of very photorealistic animations. Of course, you just look at any Hollywood movie today, and they're filled with computer-generated special effects. We actually teach some of the same software that's used in Hollywood for those kinds of effects. So you will be able to create animations with a high degree of photorealism. There are a number of different programs available for this kind of three-dimensional modeling and animation. I've listed many of the popular ones here, but there are others. Autodesk makes two different programs called Maya and 3D Studio Max. These actually used to be competing companies, but Autodesk purchased 3D Studio Max, and now it's all produced by a single company. We happen to teach Maya in our program. Maxon Cinema 4D is a somewhat simpler program. It has a little bit easier learning curve. Probably not as powerful as the Autodesk programs, but certainly it's more than capable of producing very beautiful three-dimensional objects and animations. And then there are a number of other programs that people use in addition to their primary modeling and animation program. Mudbox and ZBrush are both digital sculpting tools. They use much more intuitive kinds of tools to allow you to create very complex objects. Particularly in the medical illustration field, there are organs and other structures, bones, like think about the skull, which is quite a complex structure, that are very difficult to model. And these tools like Mudbox and ZBrush give you tools that make it much easier to sculpt those kinds of complex organic shapes. And then you can export those models back into your favorite 3D animation tool, back into Maya or Max or whatever you're using. So many people who do 3D are constantly going back and forth between different programs, using the best features of each software and then ultimately bringing those models back into their main animation and rendering program. Now, I don't happen to have a 3D program installed on this computer, so I can't actually demonstrate the process for you, but I do have one movie that was created by one of our students, and I'd just like to show you a small clip from that movie. This was part of a master's thesis project by Robin Kang, one of our graduate students from a few years ago, and she sculpted this heart in 3 dimensions. And you'll see in just a few seconds that she was also able to animate the movements of the chambers of the heart and the opening and closing of the valves. This was all done in Maya. It's possible to create a fairly long animation in one of these 3D programs. But generally speaking, most animators don't create an entire movie from beginning to end within their 3D software. Instead, what they'll do is they'll break their animation up into short segments or scenes, and then they'll bring those scenes into another animation program to assemble them or composite them all into a complete animation. So there are specialized programs that are designed specifically for taking images and animated sequences from other software and combining them together or compositing them together to create the finished movie. One of the most important programs for doing this, one of the most popular programs for doing this, is currently Adobe After Effects. This lets you import static raster images from Photoshop, or it lets you import the frames that were generated in another piece of software. So, for example, it lets you import the individual frames from a movie that you created in a 3D program, and then you can combine all of these different movie clips together. After Effects also allows you to add sound. So, for example, if you wanted narration or a musical score or other kinds of sound effects, you can add all of that right in After Effects. You can also add text. So if you want blocks of text hovering over the animation, you can add that, as well as create transitions and other kinds of effects on your different movie clips. Let's take a quick look at Adobe After Effects. Here is the interface for After Effects, and I am going to import a short movie that I had created, and I can drag that right into the main window here. And what we're seeing here is simply the first frame of this short movie, but as I drag this icon along the timeline, you can see that there are little objects falling, and I can step through, in some cases, just one frame at a time to see all of the different frames in this movie. And I can scrub back and forth along here. The text that you see down here, just my name, that was already added in a piece of 3D software. You can see that it doesn't look very good, though. I could have added that text separately here in After Effects, and I could now add musical score, or I could add sound effects for these little bouncing things as they hit that surface and bounce around, and then export the finished product as a completed movie. In addition to a compositing program like After Effects, there's also very sophisticated video editing software that allows for additional kinds of special video effects to be added to your movie. It allows for working with sound. And in particular, these video editing programs have the ability to export your animation in different formats that are designed for viewing on different kinds of media. So if you wanted to create something that was actually for television broadcast, it has to be formatted a certain way. For TV broadcasts in North America, they use one standard. There's actually a different standard for broadcast television in Europe, so you'd have to know the different formats for those different markets. Or these video editing programs also let you create video that's specifically formatted for use on the web or in some other kind of medium. So there's software like Adobe Premiere, Final Cut Pro from Apple that allow you to do that kind of video editing. The software that I've talked about so far for animation is all designed primarily to work with raster images. So when you generate an animation out of a 3D program, each individual frame is a raster image composed of pixels. And so most animation uses raster images composed of pixels. But there are other animation programs that allow you to animate vector objects. So these objects that consist of anchor points and paths, such as the kind of artwork that you produce in Adobe Illustrator. So you can create animations of vector objects. The software also allows you to create interactive media for use on the web. So you can create buttons and things that serve as hyperlinks, linking you from one page to another page. And also you can do some fairly complex scripting that allows you to create some very interesting effects within the animation. The reigning software for this kind of vector animation for many years has been Adobe Flash. Flash, unfortunately, is probably not going to be used very much more in the future because Apple made the decision to no longer support, in fact, to never support Flash on their mobile devices. So you can't view Flash animations on an iPhone or an iPad. And those kinds of devices are so popular now that people are reluctant to use Flash because they're afraid that lots and lots of people won't be able to view their animations and their interactive media on those kinds of mobile devices. So there's a new generation of animation programs that can still animate vector objects as well as raster objects, and they generate the animations in HTML5. That's the latest generation of the hypertext markup language. Adobe Edge is an example of a very new product. It's new as of 2013 anyway, that allows you to do many of the same things that you used to be able to do in Flash, but exports the final animation in this HTML5 format so that it can be viewed not only in a traditional web browser on a desktop computer, but can also be viewed on mobile devices like iPhones. Let's take a quick look at some examples of interactive media that were created in Flash. This is a very simple animation that was done entirely in Flash, and I think you'll be able to see that it consists of vector objects.
Hi, I'm Harry Potter.
And I am Ron.
Let's go bother Snape.
Righto.
I am Snape, the potions master.
Ready? Let's go bother him.
Bother,
Okay, enough of that. Here's another example of something much more sophisticated created in Flash. Flash has the ability to do very complex scripting that allows you to create all kinds of interesting interactive experiences. And it remains to be seen if Adobe Edge has that same level of sophistication to create something like this. In this particular game, you can actually pick this guy up and drag him around so he responds to the movements of your mouse. But then as he drops through this environment, you can see how his body responds to the presence of those bubbles. So that's all programmed into Flash using something called ActionScript, which is the programming language or scripting language that's built into Flash. So I can pick this guy up and toss him, and he falls. And you see every time he hits one of these little bubbles, It bends and contorts his body into strange shapes. And every now and then he gets stuck, so I have to give him a little bit of a nudge. As I say, this is all scripted in Flash using ActionScript. Finally, I'd like to talk about some software that is specialized for the medical illustrator. These are programs that would not typically be used by the average person or the average graphic artist. In this program, we're going to be introducing several tools for scientific imaging and visualization. And what I mean by that is software that allows you to view structures that normally can't be seen. So on the one hand, this may allow you to view things that are very, very tiny, such as molecules, that cannot be seen even with the most powerful light microscope. Molecules are typically smaller than the wavelength of visible light, meaning that molecules simply cannot be seen, no matter how much you could magnify them. But there are other technologies that allow you to determine the three-dimensional arrangement of atoms within a molecule. There are techniques like X-ray crystallography that use X-rays to determine the arrangement of atoms within the molecule. So there's molecular visualization software that allows you to open the data files that are generated from X-ray crystallography to actually view molecular models, to actually be able to see that three-dimensional arrangement of atoms. Several of my favorites that I'll be introducing you to are Chimera, VMD, and PyMol. Let me show you one example right now. This is a piece of software called Chimera. UCSF stands for University of California at San Francisco. That's the group that developed this software. And it's really an amazing piece of software that allows you to open the data files that were created from X-ray crystallography. Here is a molecule of dopamine. Dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that allows neurons to communicate with one another in the brain. And what we're looking at here is what's called a stick model, where the endpoints and the corner points of the model represent the position of atoms, and the sticks are the bonds between the atoms. We could also view this as a ball and stick model, where you now see small spheres that represent the location of each atom within the molecule. This software can actually be used to render publication quality image, or alternatively, I could just take a snapshot of this image and bring it into another piece of software like Illustrator or Photoshop to create an even better representation of this particular molecule. In addition to rendering simple molecules, such as that dopamine molecule, we can also bring in something that's much more complex. This is a model of what's called the nucleosome. Inside your cells, inside the nucleus, the DNA double helix wraps itself around a group of proteins called histones, and that creates what we call the nucleosome. So the nucleosome is roughly 2 loops of DNA wrapped around a group of 8 histone proteins. The nucleosome, in turn, is the building block of chromatin, which is how DNA is typically packaged inside the nucleus in the form of chromosomes. So I can create different representations of these different molecules. For example, I could select all of the protein, those would be the histone proteins in the center of the molecule, and I could give them a surface so we can see them with more of a three-dimensional form. So in this particular view, now it's easier to distinguish that DNA double helix as it winds around the outside of the nucleosome, easier to distinguish that from the solid protein at the core of the nucleosome. So this is very, very powerful software for viewing molecular models. And the ability to illustrate structures at the molecular level has just become critically important for the medical illustrator, because so much of what's happening in medicine these days deals with things at the molecular level. Whether it's illustrating concepts related to the human genome or illustrating the mechanism of action of a drug in the body, how does a drug interact with other molecules to have its effect on the body? All of these things are important for the medical illustrator to be able to represent. So it's important to be able to draw structures not only at the anatomic level or the cellular level, but also here at the molecular level. I'll also be introducing you to medical imaging software that allows you to take data from medical imaging studies such as CT scans, MRI, PET scans, ultrasound, other types of clinical imaging studies, and reconstruct that data as a three-dimensional model. And you'll be able to then view this three-dimensional model and in some cases export the images directly as publication quality images, or in other cases simply take those 3D images and export them to use as references, as rough sketches, so to speak, to bring into Photoshop and then render anatomic structures in Photoshop. So this medical imaging software lets you view real patient data from living patients and view them in interesting angles, different orientations. The software even lets you crop images so that you can cut away part of the body to see deeper structures. This is a piece of software called Osirix that allows you to view and manipulate imaging data from actual patients. What you see here is a list of different sets of data that I've already imported into the program. Each of these represents a set of CT scans or MRI scans, but it would also allow me to import other things like PET scans, ultrasound, and other kinds of imaging studies. So I'm going to choose one of these data sets here. This one called Mannix actually contains 4 different studies. I'm going to choose this one called Angio CT, which is looking at the arteries using CAT scan or CT scan. And I can view this initially in 2 dimensions as a series of cross-sectional X-ray images. CT stands for computed tomography, and it consists of a series of cross-sectional X-ray images. And what you can see now is that I'm simply cycling through the different cross-sectional images, working our way from the thorax up through the neck. There's the chin coming into view, the jaw or the mandible. We're working our way up through the head. The real beauty of this software is that I can take these 2-dimensional cross-sections and stack them up to reconstruct them as a 3-dimensional rendering of this particular patient. And here you see the remarkable images that are produced by simply stacking up those 2-dimensional X-ray images to produce a complete 3D model. Now in this case, color has been applied to the model. The individual X-rays, of course, are black and white. But the software assigns a color to each specific shade of gray that was present in the imaging study. So the software recognizes that anything that was bright white in the individual X-rays represents bone, which is the most dense tissue in the body. Structures that are a little bit gray would have lower density, and pure black is essentially air that has 0 density. And so the software recognizes that each shade of gray corresponds to a different tissue with a different density, and therefore the software is able to apply a color to each of those different tissues. So you can see that the bone is in this off-white color. There's some yellow structures, which are arteries, and then you can just faintly see some reddish structures, which are muscles. And we can zoom in, and we'll learn more about this later, but Another remarkable feature of this software is the fact that you can make certain parts of the image visible and other parts invisible. Right now, all of the skin and most of the musculature is completely hidden, but we can actually modify the image and put more of that musculature back on. We can even put all of his skin back on to the point where we see a recognizable image of this person. We can do the opposite and gradually strip away the skin and remove the musculature and go back to where we were before with just a little bit of the musculature faintly showing and many of the blood vessels shown in yellow. Something else we can do in this software is to crop the image, to actually cut away part of the body to reveal structures inside, so that we can actually cut away half of the skull and get a better view of the structures inside the skull. So very powerful software. Generally speaking, these images are not really good enough to export. They're not clear enough to be used by themselves, but they make for great references. You may recall that near the beginning of today's lecture, I showed you an illustration that I had created of the rib cage, the sternum, the vertebrae, showing the position of the heart relative to those bony structures. That illustration was created using a series of images that I had exported from OSIRIX. And that allowed me to create an image that was very, very highly accurate, because it was based on the position of the bones, the position of the heart and blood vessels from an actual patient. So that's the end of today's lecture. As I said, it's just a quick overview of the different kinds of software that are available for producing digital graphics. And as I say, you'll be exposed to all of these different programs over the remainder of the curriculum in the medical illustration program.